Welcome to part 6 of my video series, AngularJS and SharePoint. This was created for SharePoint Saturday 2019, which I'm actually be presenting tomorrow. I wanted to get all of my videos up onto YouTube before going to SharePoint Saturday. In this final installment, we will tackle the largest code page, the request.item.js file, and wrap things up. Here is our item controller, request.item.js. As you see, we have a similar definition where we're bringing in our modules. And again, we're defining VM as the alias for our controller, so we have a consistent name in all of our HTML. A VM is always the current controller. Now, I want to look for a second at these different route parameters. As you can see, item ID and search are both fed to us from the actual URL in the browser, and that we're assigning those to local variables, list item ID and search. And if search is blank, we're setting equal to the empty string. But then we also have VM new. Remember, we had VM new and VM edit, which we're defining in the router. I think at this point, and I don't know if I use VM edit much. I might use it in the HTML, but in the code, I'm using VM.new, and that is route.current.new. Remember, we can define our own variables. So there's two kinds of source parameters we can pass in. One is embedded in the actual URL, and the other one is one we define ourselves right after we define the controller. So that's how you reference them, and they're available both in the HTML and in the JS code. And as with our previous controller we looked at, all of the methods are at the top, then the events, and then the main code. So I'm just going to walk through each of the methods as we look at them. GetRequest is going to return one item from the SharePoint list. Now, if we happen to be creating a new request, we're not going to call SharePoint, but we're going to need to define a couple of variables up front. We need to set the date submitted to today's date, and we need to set the status to submitted. Now, this is key to remember when you're working with SharePoint in code. You can set a default value in your list, like we can set the default value of status to submitted. And if you create a new item from the browser in SharePoint, it's going to pre-populate status with submitted. Because we're doing this in code, those default values aren't visible to us. I mean, I guess I could go and look them up, but they're not being applied. If I was to create a new list item in code and save it to SharePoint, it's not going to apply the default value, so I have to manually do it here. Notice also that we are returning QN as our promise. Now here we're not doing new, so this is going to pull up an existing item. Here's our HTTP call, and we've already seen this in earlier code. I do want to call your attention to the list item ID is being passed in. So when we call items, if you just call /items to rest, it will give you all of the items. If you put the ID inside of parentheses, it will call a specific list item. Notice also that we are selecting and expanding the author, department, category, and technician fields in order to get the title field from each of those lookups. And yes, author, which is the created field, is a lookup. It's a people picker. It's a people picker that you don't control, but it's still a lookup in that sense. Everything inherits from something else, and people pickers are lookups. So we've returned one result, and we're setting response data D equal to D, just so it's easier just to put D.D. all the way down rather than response.data.D. So we are pulling in all of the results, all of the data in that result. that we want, and we're assigning it to local variables, VM title, VM submitter, and so forth. And date assigned and date completed, if the date is not blank, we're pulling it in as a string. Okay, get next request ID. This is something I wrote in order to automatically create the next request ID. I'm using the fiscal year. So the first one of 2019 would be 2019-0001. If you're reading the list and you get the highest number for the current fiscal year, it will be 2009-0004. So we're going to set it to 2019-0005. So that's all this does, is it gets the next request ID for the current fiscal year. Save request is how we're saving to the SharePoint list. This is going to get called by click save. So here we're defining a list item object. I just want to call your attention to the metadata. The type of our list item, you see it says sp.data.requests list item. Whatever the internal name of your field, in this case, requests, this is the structure you follow. sp.data.internal name of list item. That's how you define your type. If you don't get this type straight, then it will throw an error when it's trying to save back to SharePoint. And here we are, we're simply populating list item with all of these variables that we want to save, and we're pulling them from our VM values, or our values within the form. And if date assigned and date complete are null, we're going to save just an empty string instead. Or I'm sorry, if date assigned and date completed are an empty string, we're saving a null value instead, because you can't save a string back to a date. Okay, now we're calling validate request ID, which we haven't come to yet. That is going to determine if there is an ID. And then we're going to save by updating our list item. So this is key for how this thing is structured. This right here is our update. The method is post. We're JSON stringifying our list item, and we're setting these headers. We are always going to save to an existing SharePoint list item. We are always updating. How do we do that? Validate request ID, which we're going to look at in a minute, does a couple of things. When I call validate request ID, if this is a new request, I create a new request ID and I save a new SharePoint list item with just the request ID field and nothing else. If it's an existing request ID and a request, and for some reason request ID hadn't been set yet, I'm saving just the request ID value and nothing else. This minimizes the chance of collisions where multiple people are creating an item at the same time. The amount of time it takes to determine what the next number is and saving it immediately minimizes that chance. If I'm populating a whole long list item and saving it, there's a chance that another person will get 2019-5. So validate request ID ensures we have a valid request ID. And if it already has one, then it just returns back here and we do our update. So the whole point is, if you're creating a new item, by the time you get here, it's not a new item. You will never have a new item here. You're always updating an existing item here. It's how the logic flows better. Show error is similar to the list controller. It basically saves it shows to the console and it shows a warning to the user. Okay, here we have validate request ID like I was talking about. If request ID already exists, move over here. If request ID already exists, we're just returning a promise. Now we're calling get next request ID because we don't have a request ID, and it's going to get the next available number. and we're assigning that to VM request ID. Then we create our list item. All our list item is going to save is the request ID field and nothing else. So if it's new, this is a different kind of post. This is how you create a new object. The headers are shorter and we're just calling items. We're not passing the list item ID. So this right here is how you create a new item in SharePoint. If it's not new, we're just simply going to set, if it's successful, we are setting the list item ID equal to the new ID we just generated. So again, we just created a new item and we need to get the list item ID. We get that from the save. Data DID is the new list item ID. So we have to save. We've created a new item. We've gotten a new list item ID. We need to save that. We need to store that as list item ID. So when we go to save the entire list item, it's available to us. Now, if it's not new, we are calling the post method again, and we're saving. But remember, our list item only has the request ID. So that is how we're able to return the state to the calling function, where at this moment, you have an existing list item that already has a request ID saved. That's what this does. Okay, now we get into the events. Enter click. This is just sort of a housekeeping thing. I found that my version of SharePoint, which is hosted by my third-party hosting company, it's something quirky about it. If I hit the enter button in an Angular form, it fires that as edit the page. It doesn't happen with any of my customers, but it happens on my own hosted pages. So to get around that, I trap the enter key and prevent default. I basically stop the default action, which is edit the page. That's all that's for. Command edit and command close basically just redirect. Delete is kind of interesting. It is also using a post method. So we're going to call post and we're passing in the HTTP method of delete. But before we do that, we are calling a confirm. We're double checking with the user because you don't want to automatically do a delete. You want to check with the user before you delete a SharePoint list item. So if they enter yes, then we keep going. If not, it does nothing. It just returns to the calling program. And okay, finally we have save click. Save click is when they click the save button, we get into some warnings. So VM warning is set to empty. And then I call all of these different checks. If title is blank, I add title. If department is blank, I mention the department, and so on. And if VM warning is not null at this point, then it returns. So if there's any kind of a warning, it doesn't proceed with the save. That's all it's for. Okay, then we put in saving request. We call save request, which we've already looked at, and if it's successful, then we call display. If not, and this is key, we stay on the page, we turn off the spinning icon, we turn off saving, and we show the error, but we stay on the page. If we didn't do this, if we redirected, the user would never see the error and not know that they failed to save. This ensures the user sees the error, because if there's something wrong with saving to SharePoint, we want them to know about it, and it doesn't leave the page. So they would then have to call tech support or just cancel out of the save or do something else to figure out what the save was for. And then cancel simply redirects. If you're on the new page, you redirect to the list. If you're on any other page, you go to the display page. Finally, here is my website, douglasweb.com. I have a lot of things on here. My blog is listed. I mentioned support Stack Exchange. If you want to buy me a cigar because you like my site, you can buy me a cigar. Here's my Twitter feed. Down here under public, I'm going to have SPS application, which is all of the files that we've shown you today. If we go up here, we click on SharePoint. I have links to my blog specific to SharePoint and SharePoint tweets if there are any recent ones. And then we have here the AngularJS links. This is all of the videos and articles that I found early on that showed me something about Angular that I recommend, and I put notes explaining what each one are. I would recommend you check out all of these, and they will help you get started with Angular. Finally, if you click on Demo, Demo takes you to our SPS demo page with the application. I'm going to leave it up there. And then underneath Demo, we have requests, request departments, categories, and technicians if you want to see those lists as I have them on the site. This concludes part 6 of my series, AngularJS and SharePoint. I'd like to thank you for watching. Please click the subscribe button and join my list of subscribers, and I will keep you updated on other things I'm doing in SharePoint and other things that interest me. I appreciate you watching today, and I hope that you've learned something about Angular and SharePoint.